But I want to, first of all, welcome everyone here today, both students who are a part of this class on American theological liberalism, as well as those from other parts of the School of Theology and the BU community, scholarly community, that have taken time to come in today. And a special thanks to the Center for Global Christianity, Dana Robert, Daryl Ireland, and Morgan Krigo for their work in putting this lecture together for us. And it's a real pleasure to welcome to this spring lecture Dr. Margaret Bendroth. Dr. Bendroth is probably one of the foremost historians on the history of American Protestantism, particularly involving questions related to women in American religious history, as well as a great deal of work on mainline Protestantism and American fundamentalism. She is currently a visiting researcher here at the Center for Global Christianity and Mission at the School of Theology. And she is the former and longtime executive director of the Congregational Library of Boston. She's taught at a number of institutions, including Calvin College and Andover Newton, written several books, articles, manuscripts, and several important books, and I'll just mention a few. She is perhaps best known for one of her early volumes, Fundamentalism and Gender, which was a very important work in terms of nuancing some of the work on American Protestant fundamentalism done by scholars like George Marsden. Her other titles include Growing Up Protestant, Parents, Children, and Mainline Churches, Fundamentalism in the City, Conflict and Division in Boston's Churches, one of my favorites that I've used quite a bit in a couple of different classes. Her most recent book is The Last Puritans, Mainline Protestants and the Power of the Past. She's working on a new manuscript that is related to her topic today, which is titled Liberating the Ladies Aid, Mainline Protestants and Feminism in the Between Times, 1920 through 1970. Peggy, it's great to have you here. Glad to have your connection with the School of Theology, and we look forward to spending some wonderful time with you this afternoon.
Thank you. And I have to say, I am extraordinarily grateful to you for this opportunity, and to Dana, Robert, and to Daryl for the connection with the Global Center. I mean, I retired from my position about a year ago, just as everyone else was going into lockdown. I was retiring, and to have library privileges, some colleagues, it just has meant the world to me, just psychologically, but also in practical terms. It's just a whole world of digital resources that, with research trips, as Chris said, out of the question. This has been just wonderful, and I'm just grateful every day for that connection, and grateful for the opportunity to talk about this project, which after incubating for probably years, is now a book manuscript. I did manage to complete that, and it is under consideration. And this is one of my first opportunities to talk about the whole project, to reflect on it a little bit. The one question I think that every scholar dreads is when someone says, "What's your project about? What's your argument?" The little elevator speech, and being immersed in something for so long, you're almost left speechless. So this is a great opportunity to kind of put my thoughts together with some thoughtful people. I will begin by saying that, any project about women and religion, but especially women in the 20th century narrative, I there's kind of at least for me, a natural skepticism that immediately steps in. So many of the narratives that we have, we've just finished Women's History Month, and you're probably supremely aware of that. The narratives we have about women and women religion are ones of struggle and achievement, and the long upward climb towards a goal that is finally rewarded by people who refuse to give up. And of course, women's ordination, in most of the accounts that we read, is assumed to be the pinnacle, the right for which women have fought since the 19th century. And of course, that's true and not true. And so, it kind of casts everybody who came before as a pre-feminist. They didn't know they were feminists. They didn't know about feminism, but because they were supposedly working towards this goal, they're kind of subsumed into the movement itself. And so, as a historian, you're just kind of know that things aren't quite that clear or that simple. And so I'm writing about kind of that narrative and trying not to muddy the waters, but to create some new clarity. It's, of course, easy to see women's ordination as a pinnacle, because in the present time that we live and have lived through, there's an ongoing battle, especially among Roman Catholics and conservative evangelicals, who see women's ordination as a real breaking point, especially for the fundamentalists and evangelicals that I wrote about for many, many years ago. You were either loyal to the Bible and respectful of the authority of the Bible, or you were for women's ordination. You couldn't have both of those. And so we have that kind of drama in the back of our minds as we approach this issue. But when you come to mainline Protestants, the group that that you are interested in, that I've studied in so many different ways, the picture is certainly not as clear. For one of the things that you see, beginning really, I think you could date it back to the 1890s, that there's been relatively little debate, head-on debate, what we call proof text poker, about St. Paul or those biblical passages. And I, for my work with mainline Protestants and their understanding of history, it's quite clear that they contextualized scripture. They saw it as a historical book. That kind of understanding that tradition goes back a long ways, and that has kind of precluded this proof texting approach to scripture. One of my favorite quotations, I will take the opportunity to throw in a few as we go along. This is from a Methodist woman in the 1890s saying, "Why should there be any debate about what she called a dyspeptic utterance from St. Paul, as if what he said to a few dancing Greek and Asiatic women should stand for all the centuries. This is just not something that we need that applies to us." The problem is when you kind of understand this relative lack of biblical debate about women's role, that women's ordination did not follow for many, many decades. The Presbyterians and Methodists, of course, okayed women's ordination in 1956, but largely for kind of procedural issues. And it's not till the 1970s, and as many of us know, later, that this becomes a movement, it becomes an issue, and women begin to go to seminary and be ordained. It's really, there's a long kind of hiatus or stasis before this happens. The change has been dramatic, especially since the 1980s, but I should say it's still in process, that women, only recently in mainline churches are women clergy at the same proportion as women in the two other professions, medicine and law. So we need to look at, one of the titles that I gave to this talk was Liberating the Ladies Aid, or Why Women's Ordination Took So Long, and why it did not become an issue. So how do we understand that gap? And of course, first, the thing that we have to do is, separate change from progress. We're going to be talking a lot of change, and you can't always assume that's progress. That women's ordination was not the result of a long upward struggle and finally pushed over the finish line by the secular feminist movement in the 1970s. There was a lot of other factors at work. And so the narrative that I'm going to try and talk about in as clear and simple a way as I can is more complicated. I think it's more interesting. Any story about gender and religion is just going to have plot twists. It's going to have surprising turns. And so one of the first things that we need to realize is that ordination was not a presenting issue, was not perceived as a problem, was not perceived as a goal for much of the 20th century. When mainline Protestants talked about, the women problem, as it was sometimes called, it was always about women's status in the churches. And that's a much larger issue that deals with, are they being represented on boards? Are their women's organizations healthy? It was always a much larger issue than whether they simply had the right to be ordained. And before we go any further, the other issue, the other question that is behind my project is about forgetting. Historians are all about, bringing to mind, about remembering, and we oftentimes have to ask, why don't we remember some of the people, some of the stories that I'm going to be talking about for the next little while? Why don't we remember people like Cynthia Waddell or Mildred McAfee Horton, Georgia Harkness, Anna Swain, Teresa Hoover, and then some of these other figures in Europe, Madeleine Barrault, Sarah Chaco, Kathleen Bliss. These are all people who I came to know and admire intensely, and also struggle with a little bit, as we always should. But there's a sense, and when I began to, just read the records from second wave feminism in the 1970s and the religious feminists who came there, they did not see these women as their predecessors. And there's a tendency to look back to 1920 when we got the vote and say, oh, that was a signal moment, and then nothing happened until we picked up the baton later on. And so the question is why we don't remember. And I hope that perhaps, by the time we get to the end of this, we'll be able to talk about that. So the best way to talk about my project without going into excruciating detail and getting too complicated is to think about the 20th century in terms of two paradigms. And I'll be talking about the one paradigm, and then the other, is the one that followed in the 60s and 70s. And it tracks somewhat, if you've had the chance to come across Robert Putnam's most recent work called The Upswing. He's the wonderful sociologist who gave us the phrase bowling alone, talking about, he's a very perceptive observer of American culture and American religion. His other book that many of us find so useful is American Grace. His book, The Upswing, is kind of a magisterial look at a lot of work that he's done on the 20th century. And he talks about it in terms of a curve, a curve, beginning in the early 20th century and then on into the present. And he calls it an I, we, I curve. I hope some of you are familiar with this. He talks about, as the 20th century opened, American society was intensely individualistic. This is all about, kind of the Gilded Age, struggle, getting ahead, the kind of Wild West of American business, American urban life, and people beginning to realize that individualism, that me kind of approach was detrimental in some fundamental ways. And so he looks at the progressive movement, the New Deal, and this entire sweep of the 20th century through World War II, and he sees the development of a sense of we-ness, the valuing of institutions, of laws and practices that were for the good of everybody. He sees this high levels of political bipartisanship, of back and forth, of civic institutions, and of course, if you're, as you listen to me talk, you're probably thinking, well, African Americans and a lot of women might have had something to say about that sense of we-ness. Yes, that's true. And that's part of the narrative. But just in general, the sense of, I look at it as a sense of that institutions are important. They need to be maintained. They need to be kept up. And when we do, that's of value for everybody. So, and this is, this erodes in the 1960s, and he's got numerous theories about why that is and how that is. And I'm not going to go into all that, just to say that this time period that I'm particularly interested in, from the 20s through the 70s and 80s, is, that book gave me kind of some handles about how to think about this. And so the paradigm of this time period, I'm just going to call out three things in relation to gender. Okay, so the first kind of article of faith was the need for separate space for women, but also for men. It was kind of this idea that, especially beginning in the 1920s, after women achieved the vote, there's still a profound skepticism, especially in Protestant denominations, that women and men can really work together. That were in the 19th century, when people talked about gender differences, they used phrases like a separate species, that women were, intellectually, spiritually, not just physically, different from men. And that understanding, that sensibility, created, as many of you know, this entire separate structure of women's missionary organizations, temperance movement. Chris has done a lot of work on this, of course. And so this idea that women need to have some kind of protected separate space to do their work, just because their methods are different, their goals are different, their reasons for doing this are different. And, on a more personal level, you just heard women saying, basically saying that whenever we're in a committee with men, they just get so bossy. And we're always too timid to say anything. One of my favorite quotes is from a Baptist woman named Lucy Peabody, who said, while they can hold their own with men on most questions, collective man on a board is another and a modern problem. So women feeling like, there's this ethic of equality that's coming into American society after suffrage in the 20s, and, we're all as good as men. I don't think we're really ready to sit on a board or do a project together with them. So this idea that separate space was really for the good of everybody. The second kind of understanding, the kind of this paradigm, as I mentioned before, is the importance of institutions. And this comes at a very critical time for American Protestants. we tend to think of denominations as they're always there. They're kind of self-evident. There's not really a history to it. There is a lot of history to that when you think of it. Are what we consider now denominations in the 19th century, kind of began as basically a way to credential clergy, make sure that you didn't have people slipping in who shouldn't, kind of policing some doctrine, making public statements. But a lot of the work that was done in missions and Sunday schools and publication were done by separate enterprises. And so what emerges, separate interest groups within the church. And so by the early 20th century, my experiences with Congregationalists, and they're the worst example of this. It's a big, sprawling, jury-rigged mess with governance that is basically inherited from the 19th century. So you have the women's organizations, the Sunday school, the religious press, the minister's retirement fund, all soliciting funds. This is the worst of it, soliciting funds from the faithful to their cause. And in the 20th century, this is when we have a parallel in the business world, realizing that sprawl is not good for anybody, and that we need system and order and integration from the level to the top. The salesman on his beat should be on the same page as the CEO in his office. And so denominations begin to streamline and to adopt this gospel of efficiency. It sounds soulless and corporate. I don't know if you're like me. It's like, you kind of struggle with suppressing a yawn when someone's talking about governance and denominational polity and all that. It's not a very sexy topic. But efficiency, sounds kind of bloodless, I suppose. But in the early 20th century, this was a spiritual task. That efficiency was a moral attribute of an organization, that they don't waste money, that they get to the prime object, that there's, it's hard for us today, especially if you're a child of the 60s, to get excited about efficiency the way that people did in the early 20th century. But it wasn't just soulless bureaucrats imposing their will on everyone. There was an idea that denominations needed to modernize and that they needed to, adopt modern standards. This created opportunities for women, but also, of course, a great detriment. This new, church bureaucracy, this is when church secretaries, church administrators, this kind of quasi-religious but not really religious role was available to women, that they could kind of find slots within this bureaucracy. And no one's going to say, I don't suffer a woman to teach, if you're, writing memos. But it also, again, as many of you know, meant the end of this kind of separate empire that women had been developing since the end of the Civil War. Women's missionary organizations, which ironically were paragons of efficiency and ecumenical cooperation and, saving every penny and, engaging volunteers, to do this work, were seen as just, inefficient. There was a sense of it just threw off the balance. This kind of sense that institutions need to have balance. And they felt old-fashioned. They felt like they were something out of the Victorian era. And so maybe it's time in the 20s for women to, just come in under the tent and join the whole, and not have that kind of separate little ghetto. It didn't just... Two things briefly about that. it kind of worked and it didn't work. Women's organizations did not go away. They reappeared. United Church Women, the Methodist Women's Board of Christian Service. These are gargantuan institutions in many ways that are in some ways too big for men to let fail. And they have a myriad of different goals and purposes, so they can't really be, taken down too easily. And so women's organizations reappear. They'll always reappear. You see these male bureaucrats just like, oh, they're organizing again. We can't stop them. It looks like they're going to do it again. And our, kind of bureaucratic symmetry is upset once again. So women's organizations do appear, but something else happens too. And it's a new persona that develops among Protestant women. Someone once asked me about the word churchwoman. We kind of throw that around, the Church Women United, and said, when was that first used? I wish I had thought of that question, but I thought that's a great question. And so I began to investigate when you stopped being, when this word churchwoman began to come into circulation. And it was the mid-1920s and the 1930s. The churchwoman was, it sounds like church lady. It sounds kind of retrograde. It's white gloves and pillbox hat. But in the 30s, it was a bold new idea that women were going to be part of the whole church, not just holding up the missionary part of it, but the churchwoman was interested and committed to the entire institution, to every cause that the church was engaged in. There was no limit to what she was going to be able to do. And so you have a lot of church women's organizations using this word. It felt very modern in the 20s and 1930s. Okay, so I've spent a lot of time. I talked about this need for separate space in this old paradigm that, is still part of the picture, the value of institutions. And the third part of this is a consistent worry about feminization, whether the statistics are true or not, and religious statistics about, who's a member, how we measure membership, who's actually there on a Sunday, they come and go, but persistently, and especially persistently and then sometimes acutely, people worry about feminization, that there are too many women and not enough men. And it's, we think of that as, especially when I was researching fundamentalists, like, oh my goodness, they're terrified of having too many women. And so you have this kind of blustering, bull moose rhetoric about Jesus was a manly man, and we need to have red-blooded religion and so forth. That's one aspect of this. But what becomes clearer in the Protestant mainline is that women worried about feminization sometimes more than men. And here I have another set of quotes from a Congregational woman who said in 1925, "Personally, I find it a great treat to go to a church meeting where the men are practically in control. The woman ought not to do a single thing which might check this increasing concern on the part of men in the affairs of the church." A 1940 survey by the Federal Council of Churches on women's status, that word that they used, found that although some 70% of women wanted more representation on church boards and so forth, they were very worried about overextending their leadership and visibility, to the point that some women admitted to refusing official positions in order that they might be filled by men. That's a quote from that survey. An Episcopalian woman explained that the men are far too ready to let the women shoulder the burden of church work anyhow. If the women gained more power, then the men will just shrug their shoulders as if to say, let them take it and run with it. The perceived danger of feminization, especially in the 20th century, was that if the outside world was allowed to perceive religion as something only for the ladies, for women and children, not interesting to men, then they'll assume that it's not important. And so having this kind of visible maleness to mainline Protestantism was something that women, understood, in all kinds of, probably anxious ways, as well as men understanding that. So this paradigm of separate space for women, the value of institutions, and this underlying and sometimes verbalized and acute worry about feminization persists. So what, we can, I know it feels like I've been talking for a long time, but so how do you change this? I mean, this is to me, as I was researching and understanding, this is a recipe for no change whatsoever. This is a recipe for no change whatsoever. And if you know anything about Protestant mainline churches, they are really good at maintaining a certain status quo. I mean, that's, in some ways, you can, if you squint in a certain way, that's a real benefit. We'll talk about that more. But within this paradigm, certainly, as you can see, women's ordination is a side issue, or even in many cases radioactive. You just don't want to bring it up. And in all the countless memos and reports and things that I read, because you can sense the deep anxiety of male church leaders anytime someone wants to talk about women's ordination. It's almost like, oh, please don't. Please don't. It's just going to go nowhere and just make people mad. There's not a sense that this is a goal that we can achieve and that we should achieve. And so, there's this kind of middle ambiguous ground that people occupy for most of the 20th century. When mainline Protestants talked about women's ordination, they saw it not as a moral or a biblical or a theological issue, but primarily as a professional opportunity that had certain administrative implications and to be dealt with in that way. And so, it didn't really excite the imagination as it might have. Most people assumed that it really wasn't necessary, that if women had enough of a voice in budget meetings, on denominational boards and committees where they were making policy, one or two women getting ordained was kind of, it wasn't worth all the fuss and flutter that it was going to, no doubt create. And so, for the male bureaucrats, it's a potential hot button issue. For the women, it might be exposing a situation that they prefer not to talk about. So the latter part of the book is, how do you get from here to where we are now? And one of the wonderful parts of this project, I'm a historian of American religion, and I spent so many years studying fundamentalists and evangelicals, and then Northern Mainline. In practical terms, my research was done in some of the most dreary parts of the country. The Northern Indiana, that stretch along Highway 8090, I have visited again and again and again, and for reasons that I don't need to go into now, but just New Jersey. I just never got to go anywhere exotic, and I always felt a little bit miffed at my colleagues who were studying global. Why didn't I study global Christianity? But this project actually took me to Geneva, to Switzerland, because I understood early on that the one piece of this puzzle that no one had really addressed was the ecumenical movement and the worldwide ecumenical movement, and particularly in the 1940s and 50s, the example of European women in the World Council of Churches. So, and I say I had a brother who was just happened to be living in Geneva at the time, so that helped. So I was able to kind of bring this piece of the story, and what came clear was that in Europe, after World War II, European women were very concerned about ordination. They were in state churches that, in some cases had allowed and encouraged women to take pastorates during the war. Many of them were theologically educated, and there were church rulings in the French Reformed Church and, of course, the Anglican Church and so forth, where they had women's ordination on the table and quashed it. So at the first meeting of the World Council of Churches in 1948, what fascinated me was that there was actually a women's pre-meeting in a town of Barn near Amsterdam, and it brought together some of the most, a lot of the women that I named, many of them theologically sophisticated European women, and then women, American women who were adept at running organizations and understanding denominational bureaucracies and institutions and so forth. They didn't necessarily get along, but this from the ecumenical movement came what appeared to me is the first real attempt to theologize about the role of women. Mainline Protestants had not done that. They had not this was, kind of, it was an administrative, it was a, professional issue. How do you talk about gender differences? They had not done that since the 19th century. And so out of this ecumenical movement in the World Council of Churches comes this whole paradigm of cooperation between the sexes. That they actually had a department of cooperation between men and women in the church and society. Now, cooperation, it sounds like the last thing from feminism. But in this ethos, and as these women defined it, it was, to me, it was really worth thinking about. Their prime argument was that the women in the church issue is not about women. It's about men and women. And if this is going to change, you can't just have another women's department where things, kind of get shuffled back and forth. You need to have men and women in this conversation together. Their argument was that this unity of the mutuality between the sexes is a prefiguring of the unity of Christendom, and in many ways a necessary condition before there can be a unity in Christendom. No ecumenical leader ever wanted to hear the word women's ordination. because that was just such a barrier to unity. And so their argument was that, that we need to get men to own this problem. We need to get men to own this problem, and then, all these other things will fall into place. Um, it, it, again, it's one of these things like, there's room for a conversation about this again. Evangelicals talk about complementarianism, and it sounds a lot the same, that men and women have different roles, but they're spiritually. This is somewhat like that, but much, much different in its assumptions and its goals and its approach. And how did it play here in the United States? It was a problem. And it was a problem for two reasons. The first is that it meant that these Europeans were just sharply critical, to the point of snarky, about women's organizations. Why do you American women persist in ghettoizing yourself and making yourself irrelevant? You should be in there going to seminary, getting a degree, challenging the church, but you seem happy with just tinkering away on the edge. And so there's this, real moment of truth for American women in the 50s about whether this is really the way that we should go. The second reason why it was problematic over here is because, and again, I'm not married to all of these ideas, but it just seems to me that mainline Protestants are just so darn good at cooperating that they simply assumed that this meant that you don't challenge the status quo, that you just find a way to get along. And so the idea kind of loses its radicalism when it comes over here. So this is all kind of the prehistory of the 1960s and the 1970s. One of the interesting aspects of this all was that feminism, what we call, sometimes second wave feminism, was, at least in its early stages, it was Roman Catholic and Jewish women. You think of Betty Friedan and the Jewish women who were the first to kind of articulate second wave feminism in the 60s. But it was, the next wave was, Mary Daly, Sidney Callahan, Elizabeth Ferriens. Elizabeth Ferriens was, a Catholic educator who decided that she needed to have a beer with Betty Friedan. And the result was this, ecumenical women's religious caucus within the National Organization for Women. Mainline Protestant women were not at the table, and they did not really come to the table until the early to mid 1970s, when by that time Roman Catholic women had it with secular feminists and with religion, many of them. So this, my argument in the latter part of the book is that it took outsiders, not hostile outsiders, not secular outsiders, but critics in the ecumenical movement who, were conversation partners, and Roman Catholics who are also becoming, after Vatican II, starting to become possible conversation partners for American Protestant women to kind of rock the boat enough to open the door to make people begin to see that the cracks are, the change is possible, that there are actually cracks. And, many people have talked about religion and second wave feminism, that, I kind of chickened out from doing a whole full scale history of that. But suffice to say that, to me, one of the most important pieces of theologizing that came out in terms of making change was Valerie Saving's, the human situation, feminine point of view, in which she really, if you have read that taking on Karl Barth, who is actually a figure lurking in and out of my story, for those of you more theologically adept than I am, but that the original sin is not a will to power. It's the problem of passivity among women, of giving up too easily, of adopting an ethic of service instead of naming, what needs to be done and being prophetic. And so, the 1960s, we think of this paradigm, it's suspicious of institutions. It sees institutions as an obstacle to personal authenticity. And so a lot of the early, you can see kind of its changeover in the women seminarians in the 60s and 70s towards this understanding faith is a journey, and that becoming, pursuing ordination was really all about personal authenticity, about becoming who I was always meant to be, in the way that the 1960s would understand that term. So, I don't want to say too much, but perhaps just wind up and we can have some time for conversation. Just, where does this leave us? What do we take from this? I don't consider, I don't like to use the word heroic. This is not necessarily a story of heroism, of women who were willing to say the unsayable, to even say out loud that they were feminists. All of these women that I have talked about, including many of the Europeans, said over and over again that we are not feminists. And of course, during the mid-century decades, feminist meant something a little bit different, of course, than it would after 1970. But they were very clear: we're not feminists. We don't want to be even use that term. But they also were very explicit. I have no problem going by my husband's last name. Some of these people, I had to really dig to find out what their first names were. Mrs. Harper Sibley. It's like, what is her name? And the internet did not even reward me because they just they preferred to go by their husband's name. They were happy, in an interview, sharing a recipe, or, wearing the white gloves and the pearls and the pillbox hat, these kind of symbols of mainline Protestant respectability. You can do a whole project on, the messages of dress that were part of this whole paradigm that shifted. But there are many reasons why this story is worth recovering, I think. And in the interest of time, I just want to kind of end with one. That these were women who understood institutions, understood and valued institutions, how they worked, how to change them to some degree, and that over the decades they had accumulated the skills and experience and some wisdom and some expertise about this. This is something that that really came home to me, I'll just say parenthetically, that I was able to see because I spent so many years at the Congregational Library as an executive director. All those, it's just realizing that, all the work, the invisible work that goes into an institution, how you word that memo, who you invite to this particular meeting, when the newsletter goes out into, what the website looks. There are all these things that we don't necessarily value now, or I've discovered a lot of people just don't know how to do. I certainly didn't, and had to learn it all very fast. These people came from a generation when it was simply part of your growing up and part of your experience. And I think, without editorializing too much, this is what we need today. Especially in American church life, and especially in mainline church life. I think historically, when you look at the mainline churches, they have operated as kind of a moderating institutions in American society. You have evangelicals on the one hand, you have secularists on the other. The mainline churches were always, they are hundreds of years old, as opposed to many American institutions. They are, in many cases, community institutions. They're where the Red Cross blood drive is held. Used to be, the Boy Scouts, the town meeting. That even in some way across different parts of the country, they're there to kind of. It's important that they exist and that they are available to people, when they need that moderating influence or that moderating presence. It's a space in society that, has been emptied out. And it's to our detriment, I think, as we look for this. And so these were people of a different time and age, a different paradigm. But I think in that respect, it's not very sexy to have a bureaucrats hall of fame or or an award for the best memo or a meeting agenda, but these are that there is something really important and really significant that we have lost, and that Robert Putnam, I think, is seeing that we might regain. So that's a lot of talking on my part, and I would love to hear any and all of your thoughts about any and all of this.
Oh, thank you so much, Peggy. Thank you. This has been wonderful.